Hello everyone, this is Eric Tanner speaking. Today we're going to discuss an article titled Security Threats to Automotive CAN Networks, Practical Examples and Selected Short-Term Countermeasures. So in today's discussion, we'll dive into the main focus of this research paper. And the main focus here was to play out 4 different attack scenarios on a CAN bus network. These different attack scenarios were targeting particular components of a vehicle that are pretty standard in pretty much every modern vehicle. Then for each one of these attacks, there'll be a CERT taxonomy assigned, which is an IT security method for incident classification. We'll look into countermeasures such as intrusion detection and proactive forensics. And then we'll close up with looking into what the paper refers to as holistic security concepts. Today's automotive industry is faced with kind of an interesting problem here where the modern vehicle is trying to go towards a very interconnected uh, design style where you have these added features such as cellular network capabilities, GPS, Bluetooth, and all of these are great for improving features in the vehicle, but they also pose an equal amount of vulnerabilities to the system. So the automotive industry has to play kind of this balancing act of added features versus vulnerabilities and security. Unfortunately, the current security within vehicles is pretty low. It's just some small local security things that are developed along the way, but there is no entire security solution for the automotive industry. So as mentioned, there are going to be 4 attacks performed on the CAN bus. They are listed as scenarios S1 through S4. Scenario 1 is the electric window lift. Scenario 2, the warning lights. Scenario 3, airbag control lights. And then scenario 4, which is the gateway ECU. On the right hand side you can see there is a diagram and some pictures. This is showing the hardware platform that they developed. They took components from a 2004 and 2005 vehicle to create 2 different test setups, and they were able to, with a laptop, plug into the OBD2 port as if they were sitting at the vehicle interconnected, and they used this to monitor and create CAN bus messages. There was also, in this scenario, some simulations that were used, and that was on a CAN simulator tool called Canoe. So scenario 1 is the electric window lift, and this was one where they used that Canoe model-based platform I mentioned to simulate the attack, and then they also performed it on that physical test bed. So they developed some malicious code to read and spoof some CAN messages. The first attack that they performed was anytime the vehicle exceeds 200 kilometers an hour, it sends window open commands to the control unit for the left door ECU, and this will open the window and keep it open when they're exceeding 200 kilometers an hour. And the second attack that they did was just a denial of service where they just flooded the system with open window commands. So when it comes to critical and non-critical attacks, you could potentially say that the rolling the windows down is not a very critical attack, but I guess you could say that if you roll the window down while the person's driving at 200 kilometers an hour, you could potentially scare them and cause an accident. But the more critical attack that's mentioned here is that you could open the window, a criminal could open the windows and the driver is not present, and they could steal things, personal belongings from the vehicle. So the CERT classification, as shown below in this graph, is shown as the attackers for this would be people that are hacking it. The tool that they would use would be malicious code. The vulnerability that they're exposing is a design of the CAN bus. The action being taken is reading and spoofing CAN messages, and the target is the left door ECU. Their unauthorized result would be blocking of window messages. And the objective here would be potentially the challenge or thrill of hacking, or potentially financial gain if they're breaking and stealing personal belongings. Scenario 2, this is the warning light attack. And so essentially what they're doing here is they're suppressing warning lights. So for a scenario of an anti-theft system in a vehicle, if you go to open a vehicle door while the car is locked, the door control module will send a signal to the comfort system ECU, and this comfort system ECU will generate an alarm and warning lights. And what they did here was they were trying to suppress the warning lights of the alarm. They didn't have an alarm in this scenario to use, but they used the warning lights to kind of simulate the effect of doing that. So they had access to the Comfort CAN subnet, and what they did is they just monitored this subnetwork on the CAN bus, and they looked for on commands for the alarm, and whenever they saw an on command, they would just flood the system with off commands. So anytime they would try to get in access to the vehicle, they would be able to override the alarm by telling it to turn off as fast as possible by sending tons of these off messages. So this CERT classification below is also identified here, where the attackers in this scenario would probably be thieves. The tool, again, is malicious code. Their vulnerability is, again, the CAN network design, the CAN bus design. Their action is the same. They're reading and creating / spoofing CAN messages. The target is the control unit. In this scenario, it is the comfort system ECU, and the unauthorized result is a denial of service attack blocking the warning light system. And the objective would be financial gain. Scenario 3, this is an attack on the airbag control lights. There are two attacks that are mentioned in this research. Attack 1 would be to physically disable the airbag system and then spoof the airbag control light to make it look as if the airbag system is operational. What this attack would be is an attack on the passengers of the vehicle, which could potentially have a monetary value involved with injuring somebody in the vehicle. The second attack would be just to indicate that the airbag systems are functional in a scenario for car sales. Airbag system components are actually really expensive, and so a lot of times there could be a scenario where the reseller doesn't want to pay those costs, so they would spoof the system to make it look like it's functional. They could spoof it so that it can be seen in the diagnostics test as functional, and spoof the control lights to show that the airbag system is working. This would be to get a higher value out of the car without having to spend the money on those expensive airbag system components. The CERT classification is seen here below. The attacker would be in the spoofing to indicate functional for car sale. That the attacker for that would be a reseller. The other scenario with the attack on passengers, that would be some sort of I don't know, I guess a hitman maybe, I guess. I'm not quite sure about that one. The tool that they would use would be malicious code, and as seen in all of these scenarios, malicious code is the tool that's used. Vulnerability, CAN network. Action, read, create, and spoof CAN messages. The target is the control unit, the instrument cluster, and the other is the diagnostic tester to show that the airbag system is operational. The unauthorized result, theft of resources and potentially injuring people, and the objective is financial gain. So scenario 4 is an attack on the gateway ECU. This is an ECU that sits on the CAN bus, And before I went into the attack itself, I just thought I'd give this slide as an overview of what this gateway ECU job is in the system. So essentially what the gateway ECU does is it sits here on the CAN network, and it forwards messages to different subnetworks of ECUs, as you can see in this picture on the right. And one thing to note that's important here is that the diagnostics OBD2 port that's connected to the gateway ECU, this is how the gateway ECU talks to the diagnostics port, and this isolates the OBD2 port from being able to read these internal subnetworks. This is a key thing to remember for when we discuss this next scenario here. So for the attack involved on the gateway ECU in scenario 4, this attack was thought out a little bit differently. What they were trying to do was gain access to this internal subnetwork of different ECUs. And since, as I mentioned in the last slide, there is not a typical way for the OBD2 port to talk to this internal network, but they found a way to do that. And what they did was they were just doing message sniffing of the communications for the gateway ECU and some other network nodes. And what they found out was that the CAN message IDs were used in the diagnostic session for initialization, and so this enabled them to know the message IDs of certain components that could access the internal subnetworks. So what they did here is they learned about these initialization messages, and they mimicked them to spoof the gateway ECU into allowing the OBD2 messages that they were sending in to get forwarded by the gateway ECU into the internal subnetworks. They posed this attack as one that would expose personal information, all of the internal network data that is not normally visible through OBD2, which is like cell phones, driving habits, frequent routes. This would have addresses, contacts, people that it would give the attacker some internal knowledge of the person who's driving the car and potentially leverage them with some of that information. For this scenario, the CERT classification is shown below. The attackers would be, in this scenario, spies. The tool, again, malicious code. The vulnerability would be the implementation of the initialization phase of the gateway ECU. And the action that they're using is they're just spoofing these messages. Target is the internal subnetworks of the CAN bus. Unauthorized result is now there's a disclosure of information, and this objective for this would be to maybe do some extortion, ultimately financial gain. So as a summary of the overall CAN bus security is pretty much that there is none at all. There is no confidentiality, there's exposure of information, there is no integrity, there's no validation of receiver nodes. They do CRC checksums in CAN bus, but this only prevents invalid messages, doesn't prevent invalid senders of messages. There's no authentication, no digital signatures. You can easily spoof messages, and there's also not even an address scheme in this network. And there's also an issue with availability, which in a scenario of denial of service attack, you would completely render the CAN bus useless because of the amount of flooded messages due to the DOS attack. So as a countermeasure, the paper talks about intrusion detection. Having an intrusion detection system would give you the ability to indicate to the driver that there is a potential intrusion, telling them to maybe safely pull over the vehicle, or something along the lines of maybe filter some invalid messages that were found. Some of the detection approaches for intrusion detection would be monitoring the message frequency. So it's a known rate for particular messages on this CAN bus. So if there is an increased number of those messages, that would give way to a potential intrusion occurrence. Misuse message IDs, obviously if they're using message IDs that are not valid, that's something that's going to involve some sort of a potential hack, so that would also be a way of detecting an intrusion. And then finally they mention characterizing the communication, and this is an interesting one. This is kind of almost like preventative side channel attack, where you would kind of characterize the system with the bus voltages and the delay times between chips. And this would probably be done at the beginning of the life of the vehicle, where you would understand how the characteristics of each chip works, so that you know this particular message type comes from these ECUs and it takes X amount of time, and it always takes X amount of time and no more than X or Y value. And this would give another indicator of some other node in the network sending invalid messages if it had a different delay time. Proactive forensics is also a method that they mentioned for kind of this is like almost like a black box in an airplane. It would just do vehicle data logging. So you would have the ability to see different events when they occurred, scenarios like if the airbags were ever deployed. This will now be logged in some sort of a black box. So in the scenario of the warning light for the airbag system, that, although being spoofed by the CAN bus, in this black box data logger, you would have the event of the airbags being deployed. So then ultimately this would protect against that kind of an attack. And they mentioned two different approaches for proactive forensics. They mention a centralized version, which is just one single data monitoring device. And this would be the easiest to implement. And the distributed approach they mentioned is pretty much all of the nodes in the network would have their own data logging, which is slightly more problematic to implement because of the fact that now each device would have to be redesigned to have this. So a centralized approach would be a lot more easy to implement, and you could retrofit this into a lot of vehicles. So finally, they talk about this term of holistic security concepts. And essentially this would be an entire ground-up redesign of security of a vehicle. They would like to model security concepts already used in desktop IT platforms. So this would be, your standard everyday network security that is used, nationwide for companies and IT departments, and applying this to the vehicle. This would give you the authentication you need with like encryption, integrity, confidentiality. You could provide much lower probability of these attacks with having just some of these common principles used in some of these desktop IT platforms. It would provide hardware security and software security. The only problem with this approach is that the design impact is large. It's a complete redesign, so it's going to have a lot of costs associated with it. So this would probably be something that's going to be implemented in future vehicles, but not an immediately done or high priority task because of the amount of costs associated with this. So as a conclusion here, you can see that there's quite a bit of vulnerabilities within just the CAN bus itself. So us as designers, we need to be aware of security threats and understand potential countermeasures and the techniques in implementing those. And then just overall, just design for security. If you're designing something from the upfront part of the design phase, use the security mind that you would have if you were trying to hack it up front when you're designing it, so that you can maybe prevent some of these issues from occurring. This paper I thought was great. It was the first paper so far in this class that I was able to read that had real test scenarios of them performing attacks, implementing countermeasures. It was overall a very interesting paper to read. Great information. It was well laid out. I was trying to find something negative to say about this paper. There was some spelling stuff that was wrong. I mean, yeah, that happens. But overall, the content of this paper I thought was great. I loved reading it. I highly recommend anybody who's slightly interested in this presentation to go back and read this, because it's filled with some really great examples, and it was very informative for me to see how vulnerable this CAN network is. Ultimately, my project for this class is to look into investigate doing encryption on ECUs so that they can send encrypted messages over the CAN bus. So this was a great introduction into what I'll be presenting for my final project. So I hope everybody enjoyed what I was able to cover here in this 20-minute presentation, and look forward to giving you guys an extended look into some more CAN bus security here towards the end of the term. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.